Have you ever seen a bobcat learn to be a dog? I'm not joking. A bobcat, wild, solitary, born to walk alone, learned to respond to commands, learned to sit guard at the door, learned to play tug of war, learned to curl up against the back of the one it trusted most, the one it called home. And if I told you, it crossed over 100 miles of forest and mountains, 2 rivers, 1 highway, just to return to the place where 3 dogs once curled around it to keep it warm through its first winter. Would you believe me? This story left the entire scientific community speechless, because no one could explain why a wild cat, seemingly stripped of every survival instinct, could find its way back through dense wilderness when nothing was left to guide it, except a memory of a small hand that once stroked its forehead each night. If you ever believed instinct can't be changed, if you ever believed family means those who look like you, stay. In this story, a bobcat found its way home, and it will make you redefine what love truly means. The wind blew backward at the edge of the forest, carrying the scent of wet moss and rotting pine bark. Little Evelyn walked slowly behind her 3 dogs, her feet sinking into the damp carpet of fallen leaves. The sky in May was a dull gray, like an old wool blanket draped over the hills behind the house. It wasn't too cold, but the dampness always left the collar of her coat damp. "Slow down, guys," Evelyn murmured. The smallest dog glanced back, wagged once, and trotted ahead again. The 9-year-old girl was quiet, especially after her younger brother passed away. Almost no one had seen Evelyn smile since. Only the 3 dogs, 1 old, 1 young, 1 lame, still understood that she didn't need words to be loved. Thomas, Evelyn's father, walked behind, holding a basket to collect decayed wood for a table. He often let his daughter walk in front, because the forest was the only place she ever truly seemed at ease. Neither of them knew that just a few minutes ahead, something was about to happen that would change their lives forever. It happened quickly and very quietly. The lame dog, his name was Stump, suddenly stopped, ears perked, head tilted. He didn't bark, just stared at a fallen log that lay across the trail. "What is it?" Evelyn asked softly, walking closer. Stump didn't move. The other 2 dogs ran ahead, but didn't bark, didn't jump. They gathered around something, silently, like children sitting around a friend who was crying. Evelyn knelt beside the log. Between tangled roots that looked like brittle hair, a pale gray tuft of fur was trembling ever so slightly. It was small, very small. Its head was bigger than its body. Fur matted, soaked with dew and streaked with dried, dark blood. 1 eye was shut tight, the other cracked open, cloudy and teary. Not a cat, not a dog. Evelyn had never seen anything like it. "Dad," she whispered, "there's something hurt." Thomas came closer. 1 look and he understood. A baby bobcat. Very young, likely no more than 6 weeks old. No way it could have gotten here on its own. He looked around. No sign of the mother. No tracks, no calls. Only a blood trail vanishing into the underbrush. And something else, a twisted metal frame, half buried beneath a patch of ferns. A trap. Thomas clenched his hat strap. "Poachers again," he muttered. Someone had set a trap right on the edge of the neighborhood. Illegal and cruel. Maybe the mother bobcat was caught. Maybe they'd been chased off. Whatever it was, this cub wouldn't survive the night lying here. He turned to Evelyn. The girl was looking at the tiny creature. No fear, no hesitation, just looking. In her eyes was something that looked exactly like that day she knelt beside her brother's hospital bed. Quiet, tearless, but also unmoving. "Dad," she said softly, "I don't think it wants to die alone." They brought it home, wrapped in a thick coat like a cocoon. Stump stayed close, occasionally licking the fabric as if to comfort whatever was inside. The wooden cabin grew warm once the fireplace was lit. Grace, an old friend of Evelyn's mom, was called in. A vet nurse, she wasn't surprised to see a wild animal, but something in Evelyn's gaze made her pause for a long moment before starting the exam. No broken bones, but it's dehydrated, severely hypothermic, possibly concussed, Grace said. Chances of survival are low. Evelyn didn't answer. She sat beside the box, gripping a small cloth, eyes unblinking. The 3 dogs lay in a C shape around the towel-lined box, like 3 small flames guarding a fading ember. That night, the house slept in silence. Only the wind brushing the wooden roof and the thread-thin sound of breath from the box in the kitchen. Evelyn asked to sleep nearby, hugging her brother's pillow, the only thing she had left of him. No one dared hope. But as sunlight peeked through the window, a tiny sound like a breath broke from the box, and when Evelyn opened her eyes, she saw sharp little ears twitching. The 3 dogs had already drawn into a tighter circle around the box, tails gently wagging, and in the middle, the Bobcat opened its eyes, for the first time fully, and looked up. Not scared, just puzzled, as if to ask, "Where is this? Why is it so warm?" It would never know that from that moment on, it had revived something in Evelyn's heart. And Evelyn didn't yet know that this small cat would one day force her entire family to choose between love and the law. But that was a matter for another day. They named it Moss, because its fur was gray like the moss behind damp tree roots, and because, Evelyn said, it doesn't meow like a cat. It just breathes, like moss growing. Moss didn't eat for the first 2 days. Just lie still on the towel. Eyes sometimes open, sometimes closed, as if unsure it was still alive. The 3 dogs took turns watching. The old one wheezed like wind. The young one tried to paw at the box, curious, but Stump, the lame one, was the most faithful. He did nothing, just lay there, his forehead almost touching the edge of the box. Whenever Moss flinched or whimpered, Stump would growl softly, low and deep, as if saying, "I'm here." On the 3rd day, Grace came to check in. She was surprised. It's recovering, still weak but responsive. And these dogs, my God, I've never seen anything like it. Moss still didn't make a sound, but for the first time it stretched its neck out of the towel and gently touched its nose. To Stump. That touch was like brushing against the edge of a world where one species was never meant to live alongside the other. And yet it didn't pull away. It exhaled, then closed its eyes, this time from trust, not fatigue. On the 5th day, Moss ate its first bite of minced meat. Evelyn had sat nearly motionless for 2 full hours, just to keep her hands from trembling as she fed it, bit by bit. Thomas watched from afar. Something in his eyes had softened, like freshly cut wood that hadn't yet dried its sap. "Our cat dog," Evelyn whispered. "It's learning." From that day on, everything began to change. Not suddenly, but like how spring arrives on the hill day by day, in gentle warmth, in winds that slowly lose their chill. Moss learned to watch. It followed the 3 dogs as they moved around the house. It turned its ears just like Stump did when he heard the clink of nails on wood. It watched Evelyn's silent steps, learning how to avoid high thresholds. It learned how to wait. Then it learned to lie down. At first, it lay with its back turned outward, the posture of a creature always ready to flee. Later, it lay on its side, belly exposed, near Stump. One morning, Thomas stepped out of his room early and froze. Moss was lying, curled up between the three dogs, its short tail peeking out between the young dog's legs, as if it had been born there. Then came the day. It learned to play. It started with an old sock. Evelyn dropped it on the floor and Moss watched. The young dog leapt forward and tugged. Moss growled lightly, not out of threat, but as if testing the sound. A tug, a chase, a spin that was too graceful for a dog, too clumsy for a wild cat. Moss clawed fiercely. But right after, it dropped flat, tail flicking gently, as if it had learned how to say sorry from someone. Evelyn laughed for the first time in months. Thomas saw, and his heart clenched. Not from worry, but from hope. And hope, after, loss is always the thing that scares us most. 2 weeks later, something strange happened. Evelyn whistled, a habit from childhood to call the dogs home, and Moss turned back. Not out of fear, not for food, just turned, ran like a breeze, and sat down with the pack. Thomas stepped out onto the porch. "Evelyn," he said slowly, "it thinks it's a dog." Evelyn shook her head, not smiling. "It doesn't think about anything. It just knows where it's loved. And that's where it'll stay." Moss began to learn the last thing. Patrol. With the old dog, it walked the fence line each evening. 4 paws stepping in rhythm, ears twitching like little antennas. Once, it growled at a stray raccoon climbing the fence. The old dog did nothing, but Moss stepped forward to protect. That night, Evelyn wrote in her notebook, "If my brother was still alive, he'd probably be like this. Not afraid, not needing to say much, just needing to believe he belonged." But peaceful days don't last forever. Because one night, with the moon just above the treetops and the wind still silent, a stranger appeared at their gate, leaving behind a folded piece of paper pinned under a stone on the porch. "Not your business. Mess with the forest. You'll lose your whole family." That night, the wind rose earlier than usual. Not strong, just enough to make the tin roof groan like the long sigh of an old man who can't sleep. Stump, the lame dog, growled softly. He didn't growl often, but tonight he stood guard by the door. Thomas opened it. The sky was hollow. No owls, no crickets, just a small stone lying squarely on the porch. Beneath it, a piece of paper folded in quarters. No one knocked, no one called a name. Just dropped it and left. The paper was wrinkled, but the writing was bold, inked in heavy strokes. "Not your business. Mess with the forest. You'll lose your whole family." Thomas froze. He didn't call Evelyn, didn't want to wrap what remained of her childhood in fear. He just stepped outside, picked up the note, and burned it in the fireplace. Told no one. But that night, Thomas didn't sleep. He carried his axe behind the house, drove more posts, reinforced the fence, reconnected the cameras, and when he returned, he stood over Moss sleeping among the 3 dogs and whispered, "If you're a curse, then let me bear it instead of my child." The next morning, Grace arrived. Thomas's face was more solemn than usual. When she asked if something had happened, he simply said, "Maybe it's time we do what's right, by the law." Grace looked at Moss, playing with the old sock, stumbling like a newborn lamb. She said nothing, just took out her phone, made a call. 3 days later, someone from the Wildlife Conservation Agency arrived. A man named Ranger Beckett, tall, stern, voice deep like mountain rock. He didn't come to seize or threaten. He just sat at the wooden table, looked at Moss resting its head on Evelyn's leg and asked, "She knows. It's a wild animal, right?" Evelyn said nothing. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, just looked at Moss. After a while, she spoke. barely louder than the wind slipping through the cracks in the door. "It's family." Beckett looked at Thomas. His eyes weren't harsh, but they were the eyes of a man used to saying no to good things. "The law is the law, Mr. Thompson. No one is allowed to keep a bobcat without a permit. It will be taken to a wildlife rehabilitation center 100 miles from here. If it adapts, it'll be released. If not, we'll evaluate other options." No one said a word at dinner that night. Evelyn ate each spoonful like she was scooping sand. Stump didn't lie next to Moss like he always did. He went to the porch, staring toward the forest, where clouds churned like the silent fury of the earth. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat beside Moss, whispering into his ear, "If you have to go, remember the way home." Then, like an old habit, one she used to do when her brother was alive, Evelyn placed her hand on Moss's chest, softly murmuring, "You don't have to understand me. Just feel it." At dawn, Beckett returned. The pickup truck was parked beyond the fence. The back door was already open. Thomas carried Moss out. For the first time, he saw the creature neither struggle nor shake. It only looked back. Once, and in that glance was a sky full of confusion. The three dogs refused. They howled, torn between instinct and heartbreak. Stump blocked the truck door. Only when Thomas knelt, holding him tight, did he move, eyes wet. No one had ever seen a dog cry, but if there was a time, it was that day. Moss was placed in the cage. No growling, no scratching, just closed its eyes, as if this time it didn't want to remember the way back. The truck disappeared over the hill. Only red dust remained, and 3 dogs sat on the porch, staring without blinking. Evelyn ran to her room. Thomas sat at the table, covering his face with his hands, and Grace, the only one who understood, that sometimes we don't grieve what we've lost, but what we once had. And then the quiet days passed. Evelyn no longer wrote in her notebook. The 3 dogs didn't play, didn't bark. They just stood where Moss used to sleep, used to play, used to lie lazily in the late afternoon. The sky stayed blue, but everything inside the house had lost its color. For the first 3 days after Moss left, Evelyn didn't say a word. No questions, no crying, just silence, like the pillow resting by the window where the bobcat used to perch each evening, chin propped up to watch the sunset. The 3 dogs didn't bark either. They didn't run into the forest like every morning, just sat, heads leaned together, eyes fixed on the hill. The house felt like someone had muted it. Even the wind seemed to tread softly, afraid to disturb the ache. Grace came to visit, bringing a GPS tracking device. "At least," she said, "we'll know where it is." The small screen lit up with a faint blinking green dot, floating in an unfamiliar land. "This is the release site," Grace pointed out. "It's in the northern woods near Dry Creek." Each day, Evelyn checked the map. At first, Moss only circled within a small radius, searching for water, for shelter. But on the 5th day, it began to move. The green dot inched forward, gradually heading south, in the direction of the house. "It could be a coincidence," Grace said. Thomas stayed silent, but his eyes were red. Evelyn said nothing. She just reached out, gently touched the screen. On the 7th day, Moss encountered a river. The spring waters had risen, flowing so fast it seemed to carry voices away. Thomas shook his head. "It won't cross. Bobcats are afraid of water." But by midnight, the green dot moved again, to the other bank, still heading in the same direction. "Not instinct," Grace whispered. "It's memory." On the 9th day, Moss stopped at the edge of a small town. No GPS could explain how it crossed the highway, but Evelyn knew. Stump once taught it how to wait. And sure enough, the signal showed Moss had stayed there for 3 hours, just waiting for a gap between the traffic. By the 12th day, the signal disappeared. No flickering, no error. It just stopped, as if something had shattered deep within the forest. Evelyn held the device all day. The 3 dogs began to whimper. Stump dug at the old sleeping spot, trying to catch a scent. Thomas drove to the last known location. A thick patch of woods, giant rocks, overgrown weeds, no trace. Just one piece of plastic. A torn section of the GPS collar, clawed off, stuck to a low branch. They called, they searched, they waited. 3 days, no one saw anything, no one heard anything. Evelyn stopped looking at the map. She wrote in her notebook, "Some homecomings don't need to be seen. We just need to believe they're on their way." On the 16th night, the air turned colder than usual. Winds from the forest blew in as if the woods themselves were sighing. The 3 dogs suddenly leapt up during dinner. Stump howled first. Then all 3 raced to the door, tails stiff, eyes glowing. Thomas opened the door. No sound. Only a small, gray, skinny figure standing under the moonlight. Moss. No collar, covered in mud from chest to tail. One front paw is slightly injured, dragging just a bit. But its eyes were clear. Eyes that looked straight at the porch, as if it had never forgotten the way home. The next moment needed no words. The 3 dogs lunged forward. Evelyn ran after them. Moss didn't retreat, didn't growl, didn't fear. It ran toward them, like a little dog returning from a long journey. They crashed into each other, a bundle of fur, tears, and joyful noise. Moss whimpered like a breath that had been held for far too long. Evelyn wrapped her arms around it, resting her head on its shoulder the way she used to with her little brother. Thomas stood behind, fists clenched. Grace whispered, "It's impossible. A bobcat doesn't do that." But they all knew what returned that night. It was no longer a bobcat, and not a dog either, but something in between the forest and the home, between instinct and love, between wildness and belonging. The next morning, before the dew had dried, Thomas made a call. He didn't know if he was trembling from cold, from emotion, or from fear that he might have to let go again. Beckett answered, hesitated, then replied, "I'll come." He arrived at noon. The moment he parked, he saw Moss, not caged, not afraid. It was sitting on the windowsill, chin resting on Stump's leg, eyes half closed in the sun. It didn't hide, didn't run, just sat still, as if it knew this man would decide the rest of its life. Beckett walked slowly forward. Moss still watched him, those wild yellow eyes, softened somehow, like fire beneath a warm blanket. He sat down, said nothing. Stump stared at him. Evelyn stood behind the door, heart pounding so hard her ears rang. Then Beckett exhaled, a breath, like someone who once believed everything had limits, and now faced something beyond understanding. "I'll rewrite the report." A week later, someone from the agency came for an assessment. An older woman, silver hair, eyes that didn't budge easily. She spent 3 hours observing Moss, took notes on every behavior, watched how it stood guard with the old dog, watched how it patrolled the house, nosed into bushes even, licked the scratch on Evelyn's hand when she fell. "Bobcats don't do that," she muttered. Then she asked Evelyn a question. "If you had to choose, would you rather keep it as a pet or let it return to the wild? Evelyn looked up. She didn't answer immediately. She just stepped closer to Moss, placed her hand on its forehead, like she used to when it was dying. I want it to live as whatever it chooses to be, not because it was forced to, but because it loved this life. 1 month later, the news arrived by post. No red stamp, no urgent mark, just a brown envelope inside a single thin sheet printed with 2 lines. Congratulations. The Thompson family is granted permission to foster the bobcat moss under an interspecies behavioral study. May remain in place. No relocation required. Thomas read it aloud. Evelyn burst into tears. Stump barked, his first in nearly a month. Moss understood none of it. It simply jumped onto the table, sat upright, then pawed lightly at Evelyn's shoulder. Exactly the way the 3 dogs did when they wanted to be hugged. A year later, Moss was larger, stronger. Its fur is thick and sleek like morning mist on pine needles. It still climbed trees, still stalked mice, still growled at raccoons. But every night, it slept between the 3 dogs. And every morning, it patrolled the farm like a border guard. People came from all over. Biology students, elementary kids, the elderly, journalists. Everyone went silent when they saw Moss walk over and sit next to Evelyn. Everyone held their breath when they saw a wild creature rest its chin on a child's leg. Not for training, not for food, but for love. Evelyn smiled more now. In her journal, she wrote, "My little brother will never come back, but Moss did something no one thought it could. It came home, not out of instinct, but because it remembered. And because it remembered, it lived." The story ends there. No more miracles needed. Because sometimes one small creature chooses love over instinct. Is enough to turn an empty house into a home. Maybe none of us truly belongs anywhere until we are loved unconditionally. And that love becomes the map that brings us home. Moss did what no textbook could predict. It chose to return, choose to live differently. Not because it forgot who it was, but because it remembered who loved it when it had nothing left. We may not be bobcats, but sometimes we too get lost. And the only thing that helps us find the way is not light, but an old porch, a softly spoken name, or an embrace that never closes. If you believe, love can change even instinct. If you've ever seen yourself in the eyes of a small animal, share this story, so someone, somewhere knows they too can be found again. You can still be loved all over again.